The rule of law is under attack. That alarming accusation gets made a lot recently, particularly in the United States, and especially since Donald Trump returned to the White House at the beginning of 2025. Judges have been on the front lines of pausing, challenging, and in some cases rejecting policies introduced by the Trump administration, and have been criticized for doing so. Critics of the legal system often attack what they call activist judges, the implication being that magistrates are abusing their powers by trying to shape the results beyond the legislation that they are supposed to be interpreting. Others, however, are pinning their hopes on judges to uphold the rule of law against what they see as an overbearing executive and a supine Congress. How this debate evolves is crucial to the functioning of most modern economies, and especially the largest economy in the world. The existence of a competent, predictable, and equitable judiciary is an essential precondition for the most commercial and financial transactions, not to mention the defense of basic human and other rights. So this week on The Big View, we're going to talk about American judges. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world for fresh insights into the biggest questions in finance, business, and economics. I'm your host, Peter Thalassen, coming to you this week from New York. In a moment, we're going to hear from our guest, Reynolds Holding. Ren is a research scholar and editor-at-large at Columbia University Law School, where he also maintains the Blue Sky blog. Before joining Columbia, Ren was a columnist and editor at Reuters Breaking Views. He's also the author of a new book, Better Judgment: How Three Judges Are Bringing Back Justice to the Courts. But before we hear from Ren, I'd like to introduce Jeffrey Goldfarb, our global corporate finance editor, who did the interview with Ren. Welcome, Jeff.
Hiya.
So Jeff, the mechanics of the US legal system, it's fair to say, is not normally part of our daily bread and butter of Breaking Views. So why do you think this is a good moment to improve our understanding of American judges?
Well, as you alluded to, there's obviously this big discussion about the balance of power in the United States between the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And, the power has clearly tilted to the executive branch, with Congress sort of willingly allowing that to happen. When it comes to the judicial arm, I think there's, Ren's position in particular is that so much focus is on the Supreme Court. And rightfully so, because they're the ones that are going to rule on constitutional matters. But there is this whole layer of federal judges and courts that we don't hear very much about, at least insofar as, beyond the occasional landmark ruling that may come from them. And they're the ones really doing the heavy lifting on the rule of law, trying to uphold decisions that are, as you say, either human rights related or, up to corporate decision making. And I think this is why it's so important for us to, at this moment and our listeners to really appreciate what's happening at this next level, not just at the Supreme Court.
And just quickly tell us a bit about why you think Ren is a good person to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, look. Aside from the fact that he is an esteemed alum of our merry band at Breaking Views, look, he's been a practicing lawyer. He's been a TV producer. He's been a writer, and he's spent his whole career kind of really unpicking the law. And he also has a firm grasp on on the kinds of cases that really matter to our listeners. One of the judges featured in the book is Jed Rakoff, who's a name that may ring a few bells for our listeners. Has ruled on a lot of important financial market cases. I think it's also really he what he's done in this book is spend a lot of time with these three judges. You get to know who they are, like the purpose that they come to the bench with, and I think that part of it is really instructive, and he does it in such an accessible way that I think it'll be a really helpful piece of the puzzle for people that are, working in corporate America and the rest of the world.
Yes, and now paying closer attention to the legal
Yeah.
system on a
Yeah.
daily basis.
Yes, exactly.
That's great, Jeff. Let's listen to your chat.
Ren, it's good to have you back at Breaking Views, even if only very briefly.
Well, thanks, Jeff, for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So I mean, you've been a lawyer, you've been an investigative reporter, a TV producer, a columnist. Now you're at working at a law school. I was curious, like, of all the many strands of the legal world that you have come across in your career, what brought your journey to this idea and these stories?
Well, I mean, now is sort of the perfect time to talk about this, and I wish I'd written. I wish the book had come out. I wish I'd had the chance to write the book after January 20th, because so much has happened. But look, so much attention. The thing that brought me to this is so much attention is paid to the Supreme Court. So many people write about it, talk about it, worry about it, and I wanted to tell the story of the people who do the real work of the federal courts, the men and women who have the last word in the hundreds of thousands of cases every year that never go up on appeal, that the Supreme Court never comes close to seeing, the people who, in relative obscurity, stand up every damn day for the rule of law, and who, in some cases, are now about the only public figures calling out the lawlessness of the current administration and trying to hold it accountable. And that's not the Supreme Court. That's the federal district court judges, people like the three judges I write about. And I wanted to help people understand what these judges do, how they go about their days, how they grapple with issues and reach decisions and write opinions. And I also wanted to find out who these judges are, not just as judges, but as people, how they grew up, what experiences and people shaped them. And most important is I wanted to do all this in an accessible way. This is not an academic or a legal book, but on one level is just a story about some pretty fascinating characters.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
there's a lot of humanity in the book, and I want to get to some of that. But I want to stick just kind of like the bigger theme here. I mean,
yeah.
you talk about kind of turning the spotlight away from the Supreme Court a little bit, but beyond that, there's sort of this consensus that the executive branch obviously has usurped a lot of the power, and that the legislative branch has sort of willingly ceded it. Your book seems to suggest that the judicial branch also has maybe relinquished some of its power, and maybe I misread that, but there's also a sense that some courts, as you just said, like, have been trying to stand up, and fill the vacuum a little bit. I mean, give me your broader sense of that.
Yeah, well, let me step back and say that you may recall that a few weeks ago, Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, speaking to the Federalist Society, talked about there being a war on district court judges, which was a terrible thing to say, but he was not wrong. And the truth is that there have been other moments in American history when at least a rhetorical war has been waged on judges. The most recent one, before now, started in 1956 when Southern senators issued the so called Southern Manifesto, which was a response to the Brown v. Board of Education school desegregation decision by the Supreme Court, and a virtual declaration of war against the federal courts. And over the following 60, 70 years or so, that war took the form of a broad effort by Congress and the Supreme Court itself, as you point out, to cut back on judges' authority and, more importantly, on the ability of people to get into court. So the court and Congress and especially corporations conjured notions like a litigation explosion and soft on crime sentences, to establish things like mandatory arbitration and mandatory sentencing guidelines and heightened pleading standards and restrictions on class actions and habeas corpus and on, in essence, to weaken the judiciary and to keep people out of court and to cut down on litigation. Um, and I tell that broader story in the book through the lives of three judges who came of age roughly during that period since the Southern Manifesto and have found ways to really resist this diminishment of their authority, these efforts to diminish their ability to bring people into their courtrooms. And these three judges have each done this in very different ways that
Yeah.
reflect their very different experiences.
Yeah, so let's start with Carlton Reeves. W why is he in this book? Sort of what drew you to him? I mean, what about his story, his rulings, his life kind of made him essential for you in this story?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I wanted a diverse set of judges. So I have a judge from New York. I have a judge, a white man as a judge in New York. I have a black man as a judge in Jackson, Mississippi. I have a Latino woman in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And Carlton Reeves, he grew up as a black person in Mississippi during the 1960s and 70s and faced the racism and poverty typical of that place and time, but also found that as he was growing up, justices of the Supreme Court, but also lower court judges, were making it possible for him to attend the first desegregated first grade class in the state, to go to the best public schools and universities, to go to the stores and restaurants and the hotels and the other public places he wanted to go, and to make it possible for him to become the man he is today, a U.S. District Court judge in Jackson, Mississippi, and chair of the Federal Sentencing Commission. And he has told me time and again that to him, these people, these judges, were heroes. And what he does is he draws on history, and each of his opinions is just remarkably compelling and eloquent. And his approach is really to bring more people of all races, all genders, to understand what the justice system is all about, to try and build that diverse participation in democracy, I think is how he looks at it.
Yeah, and like Reeves, I'm not sure if her name is Martha or Marta, but
Martha Vasquez,
Martha Vasquez, also joins the bench with, I think, as you put it, a strong sense of purpose. And
yeah.
how did that manifest itself?
Yeah, well, she has tremendous empathy, I think, for the people who come before her. I mean, when someone comes before her for sentencing, she doesn't just read the probation report and sort of go through the sentencing guidelines. She spends, and I sat in her courtroom and watched her do this. She spends a long time asking the people about their background, trying to understand who they are, trying to tailor the sentence to to who they are. And her background really has compelled her to do this. I think she's the daughter of immigrant parents. Her father was undocumented, from Mexico, and she grew up literally picking oranges and gardening alongside her parents and friends at the homes of rich people in Southern California and living that immigrant experience. And she had an older brother, someone she adored, and had never been in trouble of any kind, really. And he ran into money problems and tried to resolve them by selling marijuana. And he got caught up in a federal drug sting and ended up being sentenced to about 30 years in prison. And Martha lived through his trial and saw him at trial and saw how the judge in Los Angeles treated him, which was very roughly, and resolved that she would become a judge herself, one who would have really amazing compassion for the people who came before her. And she said to herself as she watched her brother be sentenced to 30 years in prison, I can do this. And she did, and now she sits as a district court judge in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Listening to you talk about this, though, I mean, it makes it sound like the empathy part of it is exceedingly rare. And if that's true, I guess there's what, like 1,500 or so district court judges. What is that not codified into the system somehow? Like, what instructions are judges given, like, once they take the bench? Is it just like follow the law, uphold the Constitution, or is it like, hey, these are people we're dealing with, or are they
Yeah,
not reminded of
and I
that?
don't want to, and I don't want to suggest that it is rare. I mean, I think these three people are sort of extraordinary, have an extraordinary talent, extraordinary skill for it. But so many judges, I mean, over the past, as I explained in the book, over the past several, or really 50, 60, 70 years, there's been a great pressure on judges to get rid of cases, to move the docket along, to not spend too much time on the people or the issues or the corporations or whoever is before them, to essentially keep things moving, to not waste resources. And really, so much that has happened from Congress and the Supreme Court is geared toward making that happen. I mean, sentencing guidelines. It's very easy for judges to just sort of do the computation of this that's provided in the sentencing guidelines and say, here's how much money was involved. Here's how where the person came from. Let's do the arithmetic. Boom, you get 30 months. You get 55 months in prison and move on. I think there's tremendous pressure to keep that conveyor belt really going. And there aren't. I mean, you mentioned yes, there are a lot of district court judges, but there are very few compared with the size of their dockets. I mean, many of these judges, particularly in New York, have thousands of cases on their dockets, and they just don't have the resources. Really, so many people feel the pressure of the lack of resources to really spend the time that I think is necessary. And that's what I admire. I mean, I admire these judges because they take the time to do their job, to hold a trial if necessary, to find out who the people are before them. And I don't mean to say that they're the only judges to do that. A lot of judges do that, but there's so much pressure not to do that, I think,
Yeah, and
which
you make the good point in the book. You illustrate like just how many procedural things and sidebars and backroom discussions there are, like with the judge, to try and sort out the rules and everything, and how time consuming all that is. But let's turn to Jed Rakoff, who's the third judge in Better Judgment, and whose name will at least ring a bell for some of our listeners. How did you come to know him? Was there a ruling or an encounter that kind of really like sucked you into his world and his life?
Well, it's an interesting question, Jeff, because you have something to do with this. I remember sitting in an 8:30 story meeting in must have been 2012. I think just after he had rejected a settlement between the SEC and Citigroup in the aftermath of the financial crisis. The SEC had, of course, sued banks, including Citigroup, including Bank of America, including J.P. Morgan, over their packaging of mortgages in CDOs, collateralized debt obligations. And they had settled the SEC had settled with these banks on a neither admit nor deny fault, or neither admit nor deny anything, the allegations in the lawsuit, and expected judges to essentially rubber stamp these settlements. Well, Rakoff didn't do this, and I remember sitting in our story meeting at 8:30, and someone saying, I think it was you, Jeff, saying, "Wow, somebody ought to write a book about this guy," because it was
I
kind of
love.
amazing. I mean, I don't know if you remember, but it was
I'll
kind of
wait my
amazing
check in the mail then. It's
that he, yeah, yeah. I wish I could make it a little bigger, but um, it was kind of it was news. I mean, he was called a hero for our times, and it was interesting, and so I found out more about him. I just went down to his court and watched him in a few cases, and I found out that he does this sort of thing all the time. And this being insisting on seeking the truth. As one of his former clerks told me, his secret weapon is to ask why. Why should I approve the settlement as being in the public interest when I don't know what happened because you won't tell me? Why should I sentence this guy to death when we know that we have innocent people on death row and it's constitutional to give them the death penalty? Why is that? And he has this habit about asking why about the people and the institutions who come before him and trying to understand what they have done, and how they should be treated. And really to question the lawyers before him. And this rubs a lot of people the wrong way. I mean, I think that probably one of the most common comments I heard about Judge Rakoff was that he's incredibly smart, um, and he thinks he's the smartest person in the room, which he often is. But he's a real character, and he's continued to be a character up until really, through the present day.
Yeah, I mean, he made his name, I guess with a lot of the rulings as you and I've talked about, we'll talk about a little bit more in the financial sphere. I was fascinated to read about his involvement in the arc of the capital punishment debate. Can you just say a bit about, I mean, you mentioned it just now, but like, how did he get mixed up in that, and what was what was his
Sure.
impact?
Yeah. Well, he got a death penalty case in the early 2000s, or it wasn't a death penalty case; it was a horrible murder. And it was during the George W. Bush administration, and the Justice Department at that time had tended to ask for the death penalty, and he got this horrible murder case, and he thought, geez, this could be a death penalty case. And in fact, the prosecutors did ask for the death penalty in that case. And he had thought a lot about the death penalty in the context of the Innocence Project, um, the effort to use DNA testing to really figure out whether you have the right guy, whether the person that you've charged with murder actually was the guy who did the murder. And there really were a remarkable number of people who were proven factually innocent, as they call it, who were on death row. So we knew that the chances that we were putting people to death who were innocent was pretty high. And in any case, so he got this case and he started thinking about this, and he, in a really sort of a remarkable effort of judicial creativity, he pieced together various Supreme Court majority opinions and concurrences, and part concurrence and part majority decisions by Supreme Court justices, and figured out that the Supreme Court, as it was constituted at that time, had a majority of justices who arguably thought it was unconstitutional to put an innocent person to death, which seems, that seems kind of obvious, but that's not necessarily true. So he pieced together what he thought would be a Supreme Court majority that would uphold a decision to strike down the death penalty because the chances of putting to death someone who was innocent were just too high. So he struck down the federal death penalty. And during sentencing of one of the accomplices to the murder, the mother of that accomplice stood up in court and said, "Listen," or not the mother of that accomplice, the mother of the victim stood up in court and said, "Listen, how come you're not giving this guy a harsher sentence? I mean, he murdered, or he participated in the murder of my son." And Rakoff, from the bench, said, "I know how you feel." And he told the story for the first time of his brother being murdered, um, in the Philippines, and the murderer getting off with, I think it was 4 years in prison. And so this was very personal for him. in that his brother was murdered, and he really had compassion for this mother of the victim, but his idea that the concept of putting innocent people to death was just too powerful for him to do anything but to strike down the death penalty. So he really has a very personal as well as intellectual relationship with the death penalty. Of course, he was
Yeah,
reversed quickly, but yeah,
right. But fascinating. Yeah, it was fascinating to see his logic and how he kind of pieced that together. I mean, he was instrumental. He has been instrumental in so many corporate rulings. You mentioned the neither admit nor deny sort of folly. As a lawyer, he used the charge of wire fraud in a novel way. He wrote an
yeah.
influential decision on insider trading. He made his mark on the infamous Chevron ruling. I mean, having sort of really spent a lot of time with his caseload, with him as an individual, what do you think his lasting impact on on the financial world is?
Well, I think it's less than certainly he might have hoped, but I think he certainly has had an impact. I mean, after he gave the SEC such a hard time in approving the settlements with the banks on an admit nor deny basis, the SEC under Mary Jo White, who was the commissioner of the time, sort of backed off and said, "Okay, you're right. We will require admissions of the allegations before we're going to settle serious cases." I think that was more talk than action. I mean, that happened in a few serious cases, but then administrations changed and the SEC backed off and they went back to the neither admit nor deny. I think under Biden, the policy came back to require people to make at least some admission of the allegations, but he had an impact immediately. I don't know the long-term impact. I mean, certainly his colleagues on the bench, a number of other judges, district court judges, did the same thing, refused to approve settlements without more admissions of the allegations against them. He's had impacts on other areas of the law as well. I mean, you mentioned the Chevron case, which is, of course, Chevron deference, where courts, under a U.S. Supreme Court decision, lower courts were required to give deference to the decisions of administrative agencies. And this entered into the SEC's cases against the banks because one of the concepts on which Rakoff was reversed in those cases was, listen, you didn't give SEC the deference to say whether enough deference to say whether this settlement was in the public interest. And he's always been against Chevron deference because he believes, partly because I think he, to an extent, thinks he knows better, but he believes that judges' jobs are to interpret statutes passed by Congress. That's not the job of administrative agencies. Well, he ultimately won I guess it was last year, when the Supreme Court struck down the case that had established Chevron deference. Insider trading is another example of his impact. I mean, that's he's done a lot of insider trading cases. There was an example of a 2014 insider trading case. I don't know if you remember, it was the Newman case. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals in New York um, reviewed that case, and in reviewing it, got an aspect of insider trading law wrong. And now we can get into the details if you want. But suffice to say, Rakoff knew that that court had gotten the law wrong, but there really wasn't anything he could do about it since he's bound to adhere to the precedent set by the appeals court, which is the court above him. But being a senior judge, Rakoff gets to sit when needed on various appeals courts around the country as one of three judges on a panel. And as it happens, in 2015, Rakoff had agreed to sit on the Court of Appeals based in San Francisco. And one of the cases he was scheduled to hear was an insider trading case. And the defendant in that case was arguing in his defense the very point that the Court of Appeals in New York had gotten wrong. Anyway, long story short, the San Francisco Appeals Court upheld the defendant's conviction, and the judges said to Rakoff, "Look, you write the opinion. This is your area of expertise." And so Rakoff did. He wrote the opinion, but in the process said, "By the way, the New York Appeals Court got the law wrong," which was kind of a, shall we say, cheeky thing to tell the Court of Appeals in New York, that he is, you know, bound to obey in a sense. But what this did was it created a disagreement between two appeals courts, the one in New York and the one in San Francisco, a so-called circuit court split, which is really catnip to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court took the case, upheld Rakoff's view of the law unanimously. And the appeals court judges in New York were furious at essentially being called out by this lower court judge, but he found a way, to get the law right.
Yeah, I mean, it's super fascinating. But like, just on like one part of the story, I mean, it would be easy to construe all three of these judges as quote unquote bleeding heart liberals. Do you agree with that? Would they agree with that?
Sure. I mean, they are liberals. And, I mean, you're a reporter to some extent. You find the people who are most interesting and will give you access, and will agree to talk with you. And these happen to be the people. I mean, they're liberals. They're very diverse. However, I think as I talked about, I mean, they're in terms of where they sit, their approaches to the law. And but that made sense to me because I wanted to make the point that there were judges out there who were resisting efforts to constrain their authority, and that's largely a project of the left, or rather the opposite project, the one to restrict judges' powers is really really comes from the right, to judicial restraint, and so conservative judges tend to be much more restrained in their decisions, although that's changing. Um, and so I think almost by definition, the people who are trying to preserve their authority tend to be liberal. Um, but it's not, I mean, I don't admire these people necessarily for how they, or rather for what they decide. Um, I admire them because they're willing to be active in the best sense, to really get involved with a case, to really do the work, to really hold trials, to find out what happened when necessary, to do what now other branches of the government are not willing to do. I mean, Congress is, what Congress is doing,
Yeah.
not
What,
much at all.
yeah, I mean, so you talked in the beginning about, one of your main purposes was to turn the spotlight away from the Supreme Court and onto all these other judges who are doing the hard work and the heavy lifting around the country. Is there a bigger reason, is another reason for better judgment? Your book, is it a call to action? What would you like to see come out of it?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, on the left and the right, there's a feeling that judges are undemocratic in the sense that they're not elected. Uh, the federal judges have lifetime appointments. There aren't term limits. And really, the power, I mean, there's been recently, or recently being in, maybe the past, I don't know, 5, 10 years, but especially now, a tendency from the left to say, look, we ought to take power away from judges because they are undemocratic. We ought to rely on Congress more than we do, which, Congress being the House of Representatives being closest to the people. And this is the left speaking, we on the left got so used to relying on the Warren Court, the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren, to sort of come up with the policies that we'd like, that we sort of ignored the representative government, and that's really not healthy. And we really ought to restrict. The power of federal judges by term limits or by restrictions on their jurisdiction, so we can get more of a democracy, because we don't necessarily think they're good for democracy. And now, of course, and then you had the traditional view on the right in favor of judicial restraint, and now, of course, you have this war on the courts, really by the Trump administration. And I wanted to make the point that judges are good for democracy. I mean, judges, court is the one place where you can go and have your complaints redressed, and where the facts, trusted, proven facts, come out. And it's a way for people to participate in our system, certainly. But also, these three judges have their approaches are to contribute to democracy. I mean, I think I would say Rakoff's, and this is a broad picture of it, but I think Rakoff's effort is to hold power accountable, to hold Wall Street accountable, to question what's going on, particularly in the financial world, and to try and figure out, to hold those efforts accountable. Carlton Reeves, his approach is to try and be, let's call it more inclusive, to bring and to encourage people to come to his court from all walks of life, from all different ethnicities, and to try and teach people how the system works and why it works the way it does, and how it is in many ways prejudicial against so many people. And Martha Vasquez's approach is really she has an expression, she says, she doesn't want to throw anyone's life away. She sees so many people, as she says, treated like garbage and thrown away. And the people who come before her are often immigrants, Native Americans, people who are often in the situation where it's very hard for them to make a living. They turn to methods of survival that are often illegal, technically or obviously so. And her effort really is to try and preserve their ability to participate in democracy, to strengthen, I think, as she looks at it, the middle class. So I think, in answer to your question, the broader picture here is just to argue that judges are good for democracy.
I think that's a good place to leave it, Ren. Thank you so much. The book is Better Judgment. The author is Reynolds Holding. We appreciate the conversation.
Thanks, Jeff. It was fun to be here.
That's our show this week. Thanks to Jeff and Ren for that really great conversation. And as always, thanks to you for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Oliver Tazich in London. You can check out a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday. Don't forget to tune into our sister show, Viewsroom, every Thursday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. To get in touch with feedback, questions, and ideas for future episodes, please email us on breakingviews-podcasts@tr.com. That's breakingviews-podcasts@tr.com. If you like what you heard, please rate the show and leave us a review. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.